Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what was known as the De-Nazification of Germany following this is the end at the end of World War II. Now, this was certainly in the West, at least primarily an American gig. And they went about it initially, at least, and there was a propaganda movie made about it where there was Spencer Tracy and some other leading actors. I think this would have been in the 1950s, where it was suggested that the morally superior Americans were only using the rule of law, due legal process, and only the evidence, and so on. Now, I think it did perhaps begin that way, but it very quickly morphed into something else. I guess there was a couple of things. There was a view that Germany had been gripped by a certain madness. This is a perception of the Americans, and that madness had to be understood and identified, rooted out, and people had to be, who had been part of the Nazi thing had to be denazified, and then that process should be comprehensive and thorough and should draw in as many people as possible. The problem with that is when you apply the rules of evidence and due legal process and facts and so on, and hard evidence argued in court with various lawyers representing the other side, and not interfering with those lawyers and not preventing them from accessing exculpatory evidence that would get their clients off and that sort of thing. So once they applied that, they found there weren't actually that many people that you could go after. You could number them in the hundreds at best. So this was to say, well, gee, that's no good. We want to have a wide net that draws in, millions of people, many thousands, tens of thousands of people. Now, the argument was that the Nazi Party had over 2 million members. Now, you need to put this in context. 2 million! Oh, fuck! Oh. But the population of Greater Germany at the time was something like 85 million, and so if the Nazi Party only had 2 million people, and it was by far and away the biggest political party, if it only had 2 million members out of a population of 85 million, then you see, gee, well, that's not very many. If the German people were being totally ideologically Nazified, then they only got 2 million people. And let's look at the comparison, say, in the Soviet Union, where you've got 99.9% membership of the Communist Party. So that'll give you an idea of an ideological, fanatical society and one that's not. It was still optional to join the Nazi Party. You could still do very well for yourself without having to be a member of the Nazi Party. And businesses were allowed to hire who they wanted to. You didn't have to only hire Nazis and this sort of thing. Now, if you wanted a career in the public service and that sort of thing, that and you wanted to particularly to move into senior levels of management, say, it certainly wouldn't hurt your case to be a member of the Nazi Party, but it wasn't compulsory in the way it was in the radical communist societies or the fanatical communist societies. So that needs to be sort of considered here. But it was interesting sort of reading about the denazification thing, how quickly and this coverage that I'm reading isn't really negative towards the articles effectively support the idea, well, it needed to be done. So really what was done is excusable. And if the rules were broken in doing it, well, who cares? And that was pretty much the attitude. So once the Americans, and the British were much less concerned about this, but once the Americans realized they weren't going to net a lot of scalps by just following proper due legal process and rules of evidence, I was surprised actually how quickly they jettisoned that. Doesn't matter. They changed the pursuit tactics to effectively be, we're going to go after people who may have had Nazi thoughts. So if if you walked past a senior Nazi official in the street, or you were in one case, there was a guy giving a book, a German historian who's giving a book reading, who'd been a historian before the Nazis came along, was giving a book reading on a particular German area of German history. And some Nazi official had turned up, who, by the way, was also, or had been, a historian before they'd joined with the Nazi. And so that one Nazi official came to listen to this book reading, this history book reading, which wasn't a political book reading. And that was somehow picked up or identified, and that's it. You're a Nazi. You got to prove now that you're not a Nazi, and you got to prove that you're not Hitler's best buddy, and that's it. So there was just an arbitrary thing where people were being arbitrarily grabbed, and now they weren't necessarily being arrested, or some of them were, but they weren't necessarily being arrested. They would have an injunction on them on being able to work. So they couldn't work, that they couldn't, access accommodation, for example. There's a lot of things they couldn't do, even though they may have been very well qualified in their professions. There were certain things that there's certain people just weren't allowed, and that was put the squeeze on them. And also there was an informant process. Okay, well, look, buddy, we're putting the squeeze on you, but we think you know about some Nazis. So why don't you give us some names? They don't even have to be Nazis, actually. Just give us some names, and then we'll go after them, and then you can go back to work, and we won't bother you anymore. And they used various, this is the Americans, used various Kafkaesque type tactics of calling people in for an interview where, you may be by the American security services, you may end up going to prison or this or that. So scare the wits out of them, and then leave them in a waiting room all day, and then come out and say, no, you're not needed. Come back tomorrow. We'll send for you, and so on, engaging in acts of intimidation and to wear them down, and then say, well, look, why don't you give someone up? Just give us a name. Any name will do. Now, these, of course, were the same tactics that were used by the Soviets and used by any outfit that is throwing their weight around using arbitrary power and arbitrary tactics. Now, we can see this with, say, the January 6th thing in the United States today, where we're going after Nazis. I mean, we're allowed to do this. This is quite acceptable. Now, no, it's not. No, it's not fucking acceptable. And if you've got the evidence, go after them, for Christ's sakes. And that evidence must be tested in a fucking court of law, but in front of an independent judge. And if you can't deliver that, the independent judge, the court of law, testing the evidence, if you can't do that, then don't fucking arrest them, Jesus. But these things are all breaking down all across the Western world now. Activists are being thrown in as judges and prosecutors and lawyers, and behaving very much that way. Now, the other thing that surprised me is how were they able to find so many activists to go and do this obvious persecution of the Germans, whether they had anything to do with the Nazis or not. Now, there's a number of things that they were picking fairly low-level, simple people and giving them, titles of captain and major and making them feel important, and then allowing these people to act out their fantasies in persecuting German citizens. And they would pick people, and this is the corrupt pit that really, really pisses me off. They would pick people who were activists in the area or who had an axe to grind. So they would pick someone whose brother had been killed in the war in Europe, or they would pick Jews who'd had relatives who died, in Germany during the war or since 1933. So they would pick people who had an axe to grind, or they would select Germans who maybe had been part of the German resistance against Hitler, who lost relatives when the SS or the Gestapo caught up with them and this sort of thing. So they would purposefully pick these people who had reason to hate, and then say, okay, this is going to be an impartial. No, it wasn't. There was never any intention. Once they realized that they couldn't get enough people by using the law, then they started to just say, okay, let's just broaden this net. Let's bring in investigators and prosecutors and researchers and interrogators who've got a real axe to grind, and we'll just let them loose to spread their mayhem, and artificially squeezing citizens who are guilty of no crime at all to try and give up some. Just give us a name of a Nazi, just one. And again, squeezing them, not letting them work or not letting them eat or that sort of thing. That to my way of thinking is absolutely outrageous. And again, it shows humans do not learn these sort of lessons. Wherever arbitrary power, unaccountable arbitrary power comes into being, where they want to go after some people, a group of people or whatever, then those arbitrary powers, the use of arbitrary power to persecute, it's the same formula throughout history. It doesn't change. The technology of surveillance may improve and this sort of thing, but it doesn't change. And we're seeing that unaccountability, non-accountability now all across the Western world. Activist judges, activist prosecutors, activist DAs, even your own lawyer who'll be representing you is probably being, and is very likely being threatened by the deep state and say, you'll never work in the legal profession again. You got to roll over and make sure your client loses. You got to get them to take a plea bargain where they'll do 10 years in prison, and if you don't do it, you'll never work in this town again. That sort of thing is now just it's everywhere, and the idea of law students being put through the law school with this idea of restorative justice. The facts and the evidence don't matter because there is no such thing as reality. The only reality is that compensatory and restorative justice. The only reality is that this is a social victim and that's a social oppressor, these sorts of things. So they live in an absolute fantasy world, as I believe the Americans did then. Now, coming back to the De-Nazification, this idea that Germany was gripped by a form of madness. If you sort of study the times and the period, the British didn't seem to be as carried away with this. Sure, they went after people, but they were more concerned with actual crimes than ideology. And if it was the people at the very apex of the Nazi machine, sure, they'd go after them. But the idea of just going after the average Joe in the street because they might have known a Nazi or they might have attended this or that's bullshit. It's ridiculous. You saw a sort of a similar mentality, by the way, within the McCarthy era, where people were, you once attended a meeting during the Great Depression about having more soup kitchens to feed the hungry. That makes you a communist. Those sorts of things. There's still elements of that floating around, although it's much harder to bring convictions against these people, whereas the Germans were treated very shabbily in a legal sense there. Now, if you look at Germany at the time or following the First World War, things weren't looking good for the German army in 1918, and they figured, no, this is unwinnable, so we might as well call an armistice, call them into it. So the German army was still undefeated, and in a sort of, if you like, in a crude measurement, in a performance base, they'd done very, very well in that war. Inflicted many more casualties than they'd received, and done it far more efficiently at a lower cost. They had better equipment, better training, better leadership, a whole lot of things there. Now, the peace on Germany, the rest of the country, the Allies or the other countries were so terrified of Germany because they realized how close it come. If the Americans hadn't entered the war when they did, Britain and France would have been defeated. There's no question of that. Only the arrival of the Americans at the time managed to rescue the situation, and even that was a close run thing. So the Allies were terrified of how close it had come, and how close it had been to Germany achieving absolute mastery in Europe. It terrified them, so they imposed this ridiculously harsh peace on Germany, which meant that there was going to be a huge amount of resentment, and the mistaken intention was to humiliate, which is always, I think, the response of scared cowards. They want to humiliate those who've frightened them. And so Germany was humiliated, very proud people. That they were the biggest economy in Europe, probably one of the biggest advanced engineering, the biggest economy in terms of advanced engineering products in the world, chemicals and other things like that. So a very, very advanced engineering and technically advanced economy, and very well organized and so on. And it was a humiliation. And then the constitution was imposed on Germany, which created an almost impossible political situation. It was nearly impossible. And then the Great Depression came. And bear in mind, at the time, you've got communist street gangs running around, openly intimidating government officials, beating up judges, beating up the local mayor, and slapping around shop owners, acting like mafia goons. And there's these running battles in the street, with communist gangs going around intimidating, but trying to vote. Communists would openly be there, intimidating voters, intimidating voter officials, and so on, horribly corrupting the elections. But then the only people that were prepared to stand up to the communists were the National Socialists, the Nazis, they were known, and they formed their own street gangs. And so the Nazis and the communists were duking it out in the street. Now, for middle-class Germans who'd had this very stable, very, very orderly sort of life and growing up and so on, this sort of chaos was unthinkable. And there was this guy who wasn't even German, by the way, he was Austrian. There was this guy came along and he said, "Look, I'll fix this. I'll make the street safe again." And given a lot of these government processes had broken down, the rich elite sort of retreated into their estates and dabbled in politics as some sort of part-time game, leaving the detritus of everything to the citizens to deal with. And Hitler came along and said, "Look, I'll tidy all this up," which he did. So he delivered. Unemployment was high. Hitler delivered jobs, and this idea that everyone went to work in armament factories is bullshit. There was a lot of public works, the autobahns, and all sorts of things, but the economy was revitalized very quickly when the Nazis took over, and they were able to stop the communist street goons, stop the street gangs. Things became very orderly and quite. German pride was revisited, and German history was traditions were revered, whereas they'd been sort of trashed by the economy. There were no more communist uprisings attempting to overthrow the government, and all these sort of things were dealt with. And so the Nazis, we now just associate Nazis and the Holocaust as one thing, but they delivered on all of these, and so people quite reasonably found Hitler to be a guy who said what he'd do and delivered on it, and the running of the government became quite efficient, and public services were improved, pensions were improved and paid on time, medical services improved, everyone had a job, and nobody was going hungry. So in all of these things, now, did that make somebody an ideological fanatic lunatic? Just of course not. So given the circumstances Germany was in, the situation it was in, and the solutions that were found, and considering the Great Depression and things like that, then it made a big difference. So Germany went from, consider this, they went from bankruptcy in 1918 to 20 years later, having the highest standard of living in Europe. So say what you like about it, the achievements were certainly substantial. Now, if you were Jewish or a gypsy or a homosexual activist or a communist activist, something like that, make no mistake, you weren't going to do too well in that sort of scenario. And and those people were dealt with, as we know, very harshly. But outside of that, and bear in mind there are only 400,000 Jews in Germany when the Nazis came along, and over half of those were able to emigrate with, by the way, very substantial assistance put at their disposal by the Nazis. They invited all the Jews to leave Germany, but the rest of the world wouldn't take the Jews unless they were highly skilled, like an Einstein or somebody. So this needs to be put aside. The Americans have misunderstood it as some sort of wave of ideological, madness crept. I don't see it that way. Were there some ideological fanatics in the group? Obviously, there would be, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. And but their ideology, assuming you want to even call it that, it was very much to do with the admiring German history, admiring German accomplishments, admiring German scientific innovation, all these sorts of things. I don't see anything wrong with that. Does that mean, because today you see, so well, if you're nationalism, maybe, hey, you're Hitler. I don't see that relationship at all. The accomplishments of the German people over time, particularly in modern engineering and technical history, has been very substantial, and they have a right to be proud and to revere those achievements and accomplishments. Does that make them ideological fanatics? No, I don't think so. So the De-Nazification program, coming back to that, the Americans didn't really know where to go with it, so they just started randomly hitting out and randomly saying, well, if we can get someone to inform on someone else, we can say, well, that's the evidence, and that's the evidence, and we can drag these people into an activist court, and we can screw the evidence. We can say, well, you walk down the same street as Hitler once walked down. That makes you a damn fucking fascist Nazi. And so the burden of proof, the evidence that the prosecutors were requiring to go after these Germans was lowered, and then lowered again and lowered again, until they could have this vast net of possibilities in just catching rando German citizens, and then could proclaim this in their own publicity and propaganda. Look, we denazified, all these thousands of people, millions of people, however many it was. And I think that's a sad episode in American history, in my view. If they'd stuck to the high standards of jurisprudence, which I would argue is always the right thing to do, then they may not have got many scalps, but it would have, they'd have got some, obviously. They may not have got many scalps, but that the idea of that there was a denazification process that was needed, or that the evidence was there suggesting it was needed, I don't believe that. I mean, some of the evidence they produced was Hitler was doing a rally somewhere, like he'd made a speech and he was driving through the city in an open-top car, waving to the crowds, and they were all waving and so on. And well, there you go. That proves they were all turned into Nazi fanatics. No, they weren't. Oh, fuck. So wherever you have that sort of reduction of evidence and that minimal lowering of the burden of proof, and I think we're seeing it all across the Western world, particularly the United States today, that if you voted for Donald Trump, it means you're a Nazi. It means you're probably Hitler, and so this means that they're allowed to go chasing after you with the lowest of the lowest burden of proof, and reversing the burden of proof, so that you have to prove you're not a Nazi. And this is a form of madness. If we want to look at ideological madness and insanity gripping a population, that is it. Wherever you go for, well, let's go and get these other guys, and let's do it without facts, without evidence, and we'll just assert that they're Nazis, and that'll be enough, and we don't have to prove anything. They have to prove they're not, and we'll fuck them up however we can. And you see that now in legal processes where in the West, and whether it's in the divorce courts or anywhere, like wherever you see ideology creep in, you see the same thing, these Kafkaesque type approaches where documents are misfiled, documents are lost, or people are summoned to court for some sort of minor directions hearing, and then they say, oh, no, now we're going to have the full hearing. Oh, you haven't got your evidence here. Too bad. Case decided against you. Deliberate and willful attempts to subvert the due legal process of a private citizen who's committed no crime. So I think the ideological fanatics are here today, all around us. And wherever this is resorted to, subversion of due legal process, those are the ideological fanatics, not the people on the other side. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.